I'll try and keep the concrete bit short. Somebody was telling me the shortest way to end a dinner party is to say, "What do you do for a living?" "I'm in concrete." But look, I wrote my book, The Lucky Culture, to try and get to the essence of what I thought made Australia tick. And I actually came up, paradoxically, in terms of what we've discussed today, in terms of the importance of individualism. How it struck me as quite extraordinary that we settled this country in 1788, a European settlement, from nothing, from scratch, the most inauspicious sort of beginning on a country which had never seen cultivation, and turned it within 100 years into a really successful agricultural and developing industrial economy, one of the richest in the world, from nothing. And I was struck by the migrant and his role in this, how the migrant would come and would have to succeed. There's no sense of failure for a migrant. I experienced that myself when I came here as a migrant, and I'm sure many people remember that, or your parents remember it, that you've come here to make a better life, so you have to make a better life of it. You can't go back with your tail between your legs and say you failed. So I saw in the development of Australian agriculture in the 19th century this real spirit of individuals, of yeoman farmers going out there and cultivating or in pasture and on the most difficult soil they could imagine, but making a go of it, turning it into an export industry. And first of all, as I talk in, well, first of all, I think was really whale oil was the big one that they got off the ground with, but substantially in the 19th century, of course, it's sheep, and Australia becomes the wool capital, or the wool exporting champion of the world. We talk about riding on the sheep's back, but in my analysis, we didn't ride on it in a passive kind of a way. We invented the sheep. Australia invented the sheep. We took a rather sort of scrawny merino that came over here at the start of the 19th century from South Africa, and it was giving you at best maybe 1 kilo of wool at the end of the season, and a very straggly, rough kind of a wool it was too. But by the end of the 19th century, we've reinvented this creature, and we've produced a fibre extrusion machine that's producing this long lengths of really good wool that's sold in the European market like a French wine is, according to the property. And how did we do that? You know, how were we able to do that? It wasn't by and large collective endeavours. It wasn't government doing it. It was individual farmers who were in competition in a way with one another, and there was one of the big factors, I think, little celebrated, the Royal or the various agricultural shows around the place where they have competitions. They still do, but they'd have competitions for who would produce the best sheep, who would have the most wool off it. And then competitions for machinery. So Frederick Wolsey spent 20 years trying to come up with the mechanical shears, and it was just a backyard tinkering operation. It wasn't a big corporation inventing this device, and yet when he perfected it, it just changed the industry and the economics of the industry completely. And we were 20 years ahead of the Americans in developing a mechanical shear. So in these ways, Australia's agriculture was an individual exercise. Our success was individual. And similar in a way to America, the Midwest for America and Canada, the same thing happens. Settlers come and they have to make a go of it, and the same kind of innovation happens in parallel in America. There's a little bit of borrowing, and later on we're going to hear about the Sunshine Harvester, which is the great triumph of Australian, in my view, agricultural invention. But how do you then fit this picture of the rugged individual in with the idea which we've had, I think, firmly established today, that we are a society that looks to collective ends to organise ourselves in so many capacities? It came together when I started to look for this paper at the wheat industry. This is the industry which really, in my view, comes after wool. It's what comes after wool when, not content with just grazing sheep, they want to actually till the soil and get something productive. And there's a real imperative for this, because in Britain in the 19th century, people are starving. You know, there's reports about the starving British and they're running short of wheat because people have left the land to go and work in the cities and so forth. There's a demand for imported wheat. And in 1847, this is just 11 years after the settlement of South Australia, the editor of the South Australian Register writes a letter, open letter to the British people and the Irish people, urging them to come. The settlers may be said to lack for nothing, he writes, for by the blessing of the Most High on their labours they have not only bread enough to spare, but their garners are so full that those who have cultivated the supply of 30,000 souls have lately been able to send it overseas to British ports. We are, say the growers, compelled to send away to the market, for people do not flock here fast enough to eat our bread. 1847, very early in the settlement of South Australia, and it's become this amazing breadbasket. It's exporting wheat to the other colonies and also to Britain. They've made it work. The puzzle then to me is how, having started so successfully, later on we're overtaken by Canada and the United States. It's Canada that irks me particularly, I must say, because and we talk about the difficulty of farming Australia, but who'd want to be up there, and you get 6 months of frozen soil and I mean, who would want to live in the middle of Canada? It's just nuts, but Australia, we talk about the sunburnt land and we treat it as almost an excuse sometimes for our failure, but Canada and America too had their challenges. The tyranny of distance, of course, we often talk about, Geoffrey Blaney's favourite phrase, but the tyranny of distance is no different to us than in Canada and America. Of course, it's a shorter distance there, but they're growing their wheat right in the middle of the continent. First of all, they've got to get it to a port. They've got to ship it out from there, whereas in most of the wheat growing areas of Australia, particularly in South Australia, it's very close to the coast. You can take it down the back of a bullock cart in the space of a day. So there are challenges in both countries, and in both countries they're pushing the boundaries of where people think it's acceptable or you're able to grow wheat. Both countries, they're pushing into drier and drier country, colder and colder in Canada, warmer and warmer here in Australia. And they're having to succeed. They're having to invent machinery so that they can harvest the wheat with limited labour, and they're having to use new cultivars that would work in those climates. They develop a particularly hard variant of wheat in Canada, which is based on a Scottish wheat, and it's rock hard, so then they have to develop a new milling technology so that they can turn this into bread, and they do it. In Australia, they've got problems with rust because a lot of the wheat's growing near the coast. It's too moist, so they develop the Federation wheat, which is a rust-resistant variety. In each place you're having to push the boundaries. So it seems to me there's nothing inevitable in the rise of America and Canada as the preeminent exporters of grain in the early 20th century. It didn't have to be that way. And to find out why it happened, I think it's much more profitable to look to human and economic factors rather than to issues of climate or geography. And the big difference, of course, is the baron versus the bureaucrat. In America, you have the wheat barons and the railway barons working in tandem to develop these new countries and then get the grain out. In Australia, up until the farm gate, it's largely individual ingenuity that's producing the grain, but beyond that, getting the farm gate to market then becomes a collective enterprise, and almost automatically, it seems to me, people look to the government to do it for them rather than individual enterprise. It's the American revolution or innovation in grain starts very early, and it starts with trading. It starts with the Chicago Board of Trade, this great commodities market which began in 1848, really as a gentleman's club, just a place to get together and talk about and settle disputes. Pretty soon as the wheat volumes coming through Chicago increase, it becomes a trading house too. Up until that point, you've traded wheat in the street or in pubs or wherever, but suddenly people see the advantage in coming into a room together and start trading wheat, and you get the development of a futures market pretty soon. We'll sell you this wheat in September. What price will you give me for it? And so speculation, all these sort of complex forms of trade that we now look upon fairly doubtfully, begin there over commodities. And something else happens to make that possible, and this is the key development. It's the grading of wheat. The Chicago Board of Trade agrees that they were going to have set grades of wheat from best to the worst, which is vital if you're going to speed up the supply of wheat. It means that the farmer can dump his grain at the silo and he can get a check that says, well, you've got grade 2 wheat, it's guaranteed, it's checked. And then somebody else at the other end can buy the grade 2 wheat, and it doesn't have to be the same wheat. You don't have to follow it through. So the grading system allowed the start of bulk handling. You no longer have to put your grain in sacks and mark it up and send it to market. It's not weighed and checked in the market. You just pour your grain from your farm into your local elevator, which is basically a vertical warehouse, and then from then on the grain is handled in bulk all the way onto the train, through the port, onto the ship, unloaded in bulk in Britain. It becomes a much better process. So this is happening, bulk handling is happening from the beginning of the 1850s in America, very early on. And when they start opening up new areas, bulk handling is automatically the way they do it. They put in the infrastructure. And it's being driven by private railway entrepreneurs. There were 2 railways in America that were subsidised in an attempt to build a transcontinental railway. And both of them had enormous problems. They were subsidised per mile. So there was a tremendous incentive for the people building these to put a mile down of railway very quickly. And they put it down and then the ground would freeze and they'd come back and it had cracked up. And they'd have to start again. There was another restriction put on them. They had to use American steel for the railways. That was part of the condition of getting the subsidies. American steel in those days wasn't terribly good, and that too would crack. All sorts of disincentives or unintended consequences through the subsidisation of the rail network crept in. There was one entrepreneur, possibly I think the most famous and heroic of all American entrepreneurs, James J. Hill, who went it alone. He didn't take any subsidies whatsoever. He could just see he could make a business case for forging a railway which would become a transcontinental railway out of Minnesota. And he looked around. It was his own money he was risking here. It wasn't government money, so he had to be careful. And he looked for areas where he could see settlement was possible. He looked into Canada and started to drive his railway up into Manitoba. Each time selling land as he went, buying land, selling it. Selling land to grain handling companies who build their elevators. They build 3, 4 elevators in a new town with no people in it as a way of attracting people to come and settle there. So from the start, settlement and the railways and the putting in of this bulk handling infrastructure is driven by animal spirits, somebody wanting to get rich. And alongside the railway entrepreneurs, you had the grain entrepreneurs, the wheat barons. And these people would try and corner the market for wheat silos so that they get all the grain from that area. And the railway system would be like a huge river. So you'd want to get your grain in, flowing down there, and if possible, keep the supply from that line. You'd have these line monopolies. Things we might today think were sharp practices, but then this was part of the business model. Not only that, but the grain barons would then store up wheat as best as they could and then dump it into the Chicago market, thereby manipulating the market by a matter of cents in some cases. So it was the kind of practice that today we might think we need regulations for, but in America in that period, the judiciary was generally forgiving of this kind of thing. They recognised that business regulating itself was the best option, and the Chicago Board of Trade, which I said was a private company basically, just a bunch of mates, they were happy just to let these people regulate it themselves by and large, with a few restrictions. And the legislature too was loath to intervene. Towards the end of the 19th century, you get the farmers start getting aggravated. You know, they think that the grain handlers and the railway barons are ripping off their money, so they want legislation put into place to stop this. They want anti sort of cooperation legislation put through the federal legislature in Washington. It's there for 4 or 5 years and it gets tossed around, but in the end they decide not to do it. They just let the market sort itself out, if you like. So it's in this environment that you get this massive expansion of bulk handling, and it spreads into Canada too, because, as I say, this little tail of the railway goes up, and when they build the Canadian Pacific Railway, which is a sort of nation-building project to pull Canada together, they build it on the same principle. They have the private sector do it. They give them parcels of land that they can then realise the increased value of that land. And so Canada too falls pretty much into this entrepreneurial model with bulk grain handling. And then by the start of the 20th century, there's the new innovation comes in. They find that these big wooden silos they build are catching fire, and the insurance is too much. They're not economical. So a grain handler called Peavy, William H. Peavy in Minneapolis, realises there's this new substance on the market, reinforced concrete, and he builds an experimental grain elevator in 1900 in St. Paul's in Minnesota, just to try this stuff out, and they find it's wonderful. So from then on you get 1900, the expansion of these massive grain elevators across the country, able to store enormous amounts of grain in good condition for a year or two if they want to, made out of concrete. So what's happening in Australia at that time? Well, nothing much of that sort whatsoever. You'll know General Sir John Monash, of course, our great World War I hero. Little known that some people know, we were discussing yesterday, but he was an engineer, as we know, but he was an expert in reinforced concrete. He bought the contract from a German company, the Monnier company, to produce reinforced concrete in Victoria, build a couple of bridges, built a number of bridges in fact. But then he was looking for new uses for this and thought, well, grain silos is the way to go, but he couldn't get a buyer for it. So instead he used it to build a brewery. He built the first swimming pool out of reinforced concrete, lots of things, but he couldn't get it going. We had the technology to do it, but there was no business plan to do it. Because Australian wheat was being put into bags at that stage, and he would be put into bags at the factory, loaded onto the truck, taken down to the port. In South Australia, it would be loaded and unloaded maybe 3 or 4 times before it actually got onto the ship that would take it out to Britain. And so they found in 1908, when the South Australian government set up a Royal Commission to look at this problem, they found that in America they were able to get the grain from America to Britain for a penny a bushel. In South Australia it was costing them a penny and a half just to get the grain onto the cart, and then 7p halfpenny to get it to London. Nobody up until that point, from my reading, seemed particularly troubled about this. They weren't really worried about cost and efficiency because the market was growing. They could sell all they wanted to at almost whatever price. But they start to realise at the start of the 20th century that actually cost and efficiency does matter, and it's making their grain market uncompetitive. And so they start looking to see whether they can introduce bulk handling here. And of course, like the railways, which I've skipped a bit here, but you probably know the history, or broadly the history of the railways in Australia. People in the room know it much better than I do, but it was a government enterprise almost from the start. There was a brief attempt in New South Wales at allowing the private sector to build railways, which didn't immediately take off. So the government decided in New South Wales from the start that railways had to be built and run by the government, which effectively meant bureaucrats, and that same pattern pretty much happened across the country. So it was the bureaucrats who would decide where the best place for the lines were, not the market. Sometimes you'd have some political interference too. A politician would think he'd want to get it through a certain area to keep a certain electorate happy, or his local farmers happy, and that would distort it too. But we end up with a very complex and messy system of railways, completely based largely as sort of little spiders networks that go out from each capital city, hardly connecting across state borders. And no thought given to the infrastructure of grain handling, except for long flat warehouses that would be built to store the grain, which would then of course be eaten by the vermin and so forth. But around the early 1908, 1910, they start thinking about grain handling and can it be introduced? And it's a long and drawn out debate, because in the end, the only way of doing this in people's imaginations is again to leave it to the government to do, and it would require a tremendous amount of investment to pull out the warehouses they've got, put new ones in. You've got to put new ports in, or new port infrastructure to put it onto ships. It just in the end falls into the too hard basket, I think, as far as Australia is concerned, before World War I. So we go into World War I with no bulk handling to speak of, with no system of grading grain except for one. We had one standard of grain, which was called fair average quality. Which almost sort of sums up the Australian way of looking at these things. Fair average quality. The reports of that time, explain the chaos that there would be. They had a whole trade called lumpers, and lumpers' job was to lift these sacks of wheat on and off carts and onto ships. And the back injury, of course, was a big occupational hazard, so they announced that they'd cut the size of the bags in South Australia so as not to strain the backs of the lumpers, at which point the lumpers went on strike for many months to get the big bags back, because they were nervous that if Chinese would come in and be able to lift the smaller bags, whereas of course they'd be too fragile to lift the big bags, so they kept the big bags as a form of protection. All these distortions are going on in the market and are more or less tolerated. Nobody can really think of what else you can do, really. And so it's not surprising that by World War I, after having quite a good share of the grain market in the late 19th century, we've fallen behind Canada. Canada's wheat production has basically doubled between 1900 and 1914. Australia's has stayed pretty much the same. And from then on, we're not a big player. We are a player, but we're not selling the sort of quantities where you get out of America and Canada. And it's not until after World War I that you start to get bulk handling introduced. West Australia is a wonderful example of how it should be done. They had their grain industry happened a bit later than the rest of the country, so they started the bulk handling debate in earnest after World War I, and with cooperative bulk handling, which were basically sort of cooperative companies, they had it up and running, and right to this day, I think West Australia has the edge in terms of grain marketing and delivery. So what conclusions can we draw from this little parable, if you like? Well, first of all, as I say, I'm assuming that we agree that the prevailing conditions for growing and trading were different but equally challenging in both territories, so we can't put it down to that. But in both North America and Australia, they fulfilled, I think, Adam Smith's prediction. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in 1777, somebody can tell me. 1776. 12 years before Australia settled, he writes, "A civilised nation which takes possession of either waste country or one so thinly inhabited that the natives easily give place to the new settlers advances more rapidly to wealth and greatness than any other human society. The colonists carry out with them a knowledge of agriculture and other useful arts superior to what can grow up of its own accord in the course of many centuries amongst savage and barbarous nations. So he's got that bit right for both continents. Then there's another element that Adam Smith puts in, and this is where the differences are. The habit of subordination, some notion of the regular government which takes place in their own country, the system of laws which supports it, and the regular administration of justice, they naturally establish something of the same kind in the new settlement. Yes, they bring the institutions with them, but in Australia and America they take a slightly different form in terms of the role played by the individual entrepreneur and the role played collectively by government, and that's the point at which I think the big differences open up in our ability to become an efficient grain producing country. I've left aside here, by the way, I'll foreshadow some criticisms of the availability of capital and so forth. Whether we had private entrepreneurs or whether private entrepreneurs were likely to invest on that scale. In Australia at that stage, the population scale was different. The amount of available land that was productive was different. So all these things feed into it, and it was left to the government in the end to make the investment. But there is, I think, a strong lesson here for the provision of infrastructure. You can see the parable, I think, for the national broadband network. That a government-built network or a government-subsidised network is always going to be produced, have all sorts of strange little things happen to it along the way. It's not working, it's not being driven according to the discipline that comes when you've got your own capital resting in it. Private investment in infrastructure generally seems to be a good way to look forward, but also a particular kind of private sector investment, one in which the investor gets an uplift, gets a share of the uplift of the value of what comes afterwards. In this case, it was land. It might be, as some models have been developed, of course, for toll roads, it might be in a share of the traffic they produce in the roads. But if you can give the investor an incentive to grow and increase that market so that he can do it, as James Hill did, the railway engineer, used to put money into going out and teaching farmers how to farm because he wanted them to be successful so that his business succeeded. If you can build that into your model, you're going to be a lot more successful. The other interesting footnote, I think, is in the recent debate in Australia over the proposed takeover of Graincorp in the eastern states by Arthur Daniel Midlands. Why is it that America has these big corporations that are able to really dominate the world market in grain, and when we're looking for somebody that can bring capital and innovation into the Australian grain market, they become the natural buyers? 60% of the world's grain trade is carried out by 4 companies, all of them based in Minnesota, in the Midwest of America. These are, if you like, the successors, the people who followed on from the game barons, the corporations that grew up out of that wealth that was produced there, and they still dominate the market. The Canadians too, the Saskatchewan wheat pool, which was a big cooperative trader there, it's morphed into what's now Viterra, which controls runs the wheat market pretty much in South Australia and Western Victoria. So the legacy of not having that wheat baron, that sort of raw capitalism happening in our agricultural market is that we don't now have large corporations able to attract the capital investment that we now need. We're now having to rely on others elsewhere. So I think that's about as far as I get to with this, except to throw it open to questions and look for people to pick holes in it.
Thanks, Sharon.
Greg, in his talk, really challenged you, I think, with the breadth of reading that he expected from everybody. I'm a bit surprised that you didn't get a chance to refer to a classic book by D.C. Winterbottom, which has probably the best title of any book I've ever come across, written in Australia in 1918 or 1919, just after the First World War. It's called Weevils in wheat and storage of grain in bags. Now, I think that's a classic, catchy title that you could have referred to.
Could you lend me your copy?
I think I left it to somebody who hadn't got it. It is in the National Library.
Yes, well, it goes to, well, it's a comment on that they even had to write a book of that nature.
I did a bit of work on the wheat industry in the First World War, and yes, the British government ended up buying our entire wheat crop for 1915 and 16, when they thought that the North American crop was going to fail. It turned out that it didn't fail, so the British owned our wheat crop, and they just left it sitting in bags, and it was all eaten by weevils, mice, and just absolutely destroyed. But it wasn't our problem. The British government had paid for it.
Thanks. Yes. Is there a question there?
Hello, my name is John Ogilvie. I'm a 17-year-old that believes in the free market and liberty. Now, in your speech, you talked a lot about rugged individualism, and I think we both agree that's a pivotal part and a vital part of Western civilization. But it seems to me that in recent years, the government has tried to cripple this idea through the use of subsidies, regulations, and entitlement programs. And I suppose my question is, why do you think that the government wants to destroy this idea of rugged individualism, and why do you think that it wants to be this paternalistic entity?
Well, I think it hinges on the notion of risk, and we now have a risk-averse culture in which government perceives that it is its job to remove all possible risk out of our lives. And in part, that's why I think that they want to insure us against what could be outlandish business practices that might end up into trouble, or in this case, in terms of infrastructure or those sort of issues, take the risk that really would be better taken by private entrepreneurs. So I think if you look, the question of risk, I think, is key to it, and to some of a lot of what we've been saying today, actually, and we somehow have to, I think, recover the idea that risk is not only acceptable but actually is a good thing. That people who take risks are people who end up achieving and growing wealth, and people who don't take risks are ones that end up just shrinking the pie. So that's the way I tend to think of it, I think. Yeah.
In fact, it's really, really interesting. And I think the comparisons are interesting, but I think it's a bit dangerous. So when you talked about North America, you seem to blend together the US and Canada. So the main Canadian railways, really heavily subsidised. Nobody puts in their own money, hardly. They all borrow in London. And why could Australians not have done the same thing? So to still leave open the question, why was there resistance to technical change, the bagging and the grading in Australia? It doesn't seem like such a big difference in terms of the infrastructure. The US are clearly different. You've got the rail barons, but in Canada it's the same thing. And just as an appendix to that, when I talk to Canadian friends, they don't talk about agriculture, they talk about mining, and say, how come Australia's got these global companies in mining, but we don't? So it sometimes depends where you look.
Oh, I suppose it does. No, the Canadian rail thing, I don't tend to have the full picture on this, but one thing they did was that they built it earlier. They built their transcontinental railway much earlier than we did. It was an important project for them. They wanted to get it complete because there was a dangerous secession of some of the states. Point number one. Point number two, it was in competition. It was in strong competition with the American railways for that transcontinental route. And there was a price battle that went on for some time on freight carrying rates, which kept profitability down because they were competing against Great Northern and others. If you were a farmer in Manitoba, for instance, you had a choice. You could send it out on the Canadian Pacific, or you could send it down through Minneapolis and into the Great Lakes. It ended up at a similar point in the Great Lakes, but it was a different. So there's a fight going on for the trade. So I think that proximity to Canada, to America, was the thing that kept the Canadian grain market competitive from the start, because of course it starts later than the United States. And then starts on the same model, so bulk handling is part of the model at the start.
In the 1890s, the prices are regulated by the cross-national agreement.
Are they? In Canada?
Yeah, but not in the US.
Yeah.
So it's got a lot of similarities here, and yet we have a different outcome. And that seems a puzzle.
Yeah, I know, and I think this is worthy of more exploration. And then the post-World War I phase in Canada, where the agrarian interests really come to the fore, and you start getting these big cooperative enterprises, which nonetheless seem to succeed. And it warrants further investigation. But one of the big advantages was that they already had the infrastructure for bulk handling in place, whereas that was a step that Australia hadn't yet taken. Yeah.
There's one last question from Mark.
I'd just like to ask a question whether it's possible that there might have been more entrepreneurship in Australia than what you suggests if we invested elsewhere more efficiently. Thinking obviously of wool. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got a wool industry that's thriving. Is it not better to build new dams, fences, to exploit where you have the advantage over other countries? So it could be that in one area we're falling backwards because there's another alternative investment which is more appropriate for the Australian condition. I don't know the answer, but it's a question that came to my mind.
Well, yeah, and the comparison with mining is interesting, isn't it? We did get these entrepreneurs, these barons, and we had it in wool too. You know, the big wool trading houses were driven by, individual entrepreneurs, usually Scottish for some reason. But anyway, there's a whole story about the Enlightenment there somewhere. But that worked with wool. The logistical problems with wool, of course, were much smaller. It was 10 times more valuable per unit of weight, so it was a much easier thing to transport. But nonetheless, we did it with wool, but we failed with wheat, is my thesis.
Thank you very much.